Throughout my childhood, I lived and grew up in Indiana. And to be a little more precise, my house was in a rural part of Indiana. And for those who aren't so well versed with my state, when I say rural, I mean the middle of absolutely nowhere in Indiana. The closest grocery store from my house was a minimum 20-minute long drive, but that too without traffic and during good weather. Speaking of me, I used to love exploring a lot, and I would just go driving around on new roads, simply to look around and explore whatever there was to see. While doing this, I have come upon a little more than my fair share of something's not quite right kind of roads. I have a couple of stories to share, which I can remember off the top of my mind. I believe you'd love one story the most, because that one incident has fascinated every single person I have told it to. But before that story, let me tell you a different story that I might forget later. So let's begin with it right away. It has happened a couple of times in my life that I have been followed by strangers. As usual, I used to be out driving my car in an area that I'd never been to before. And I used to love to explore places that were impressively extra-rural. As in places that had no houses, no telephone poles, and nothing whatsoever for miles at a stretch. So I was in a place where the road takes an unusually shaped turn through some incredibly thick trees, and halfway through that curve, I am suddenly met with a decline down into a beautiful creek flowing down a valley. If you've ever heard or come across the term, the hollers of Kentucky, but never had a mental image of what a hollow is, that was it. That view was a picture-perfect example. There was nothing but thickly wooded inclines back up to standard elevation for the region to my right, and on my left is a still young cornfield and a creek within a short distance. Beyond that was the other side of this little valley, sloping back upwards towards normalcy and also heavily wooded. This place was beautiful to see, and I was very much enjoying myself. For a moment it just gave me a vibe that I was in Narnia. The hollow wasn't terribly wide, but I've got to tell you that it was longer than you'd expect. Very unexpectedly, I come around a curve in the hollow as it followed the creek, and I am suddenly in view of an upcoming property on my right, nestled into the wooded incline. I pass one single rundown house with a couple of barns in an advanced state of decay, a heavily overgrown yard, and a small collection of very ratty cars in various states of disassembly. All of them were quite heavily rusted. It was daylight, so I couldn't tell if lights were switched on in the house, but it was the kind of place that you see and just immediately, unquestioningly presume to be long abandoned. It just had an abandoned look attached to it. Then suddenly, the entire valley felt uncomfortable and unwelcoming. The feeling just slapped me out of nowhere. I simply can't explain it or elaborate on it, but I just knew for sure that someone was, or some people were on that property, and they watched me when I passed it. Less than 5 to 10 minutes later, this bright orange jacked-up Chevy pickup was in my rear view, and it was gaining on me. I applied some pressure to the gas and made a turn back towards the nearest small town. He turned in the same direction as mine and was still gaining on me. The road wasn't exactly supportive of my car, whereas his pickup seemed adaptive to the terrain. This small town seemed more like a ghost town. The entire purpose of getting there was so that I could find help if required. But there was literally no one around here at all. So I picked up as much pace as I could and made another turn towards the closest real town, the one with the grocery stores and restaurants. As I kept driving, I kept checking the rear view, and this guy was still coming in my direction and was in fact getting closer and closer. Now I could even read his number plate. I turned, then turned, again and again, to get onto the main local road. I gunned it to that road as I knew there would be some traffic there. And I was right. I let a sigh of partial relief, as there were other cars around now, but none were between my car and his. I somehow managed to maintain space between us, but I'm not positive that it wasn't without him allowing it. As I was now very close to the town and on a road with multiple cars around, I turned off the local highway to use a small out-of-the-way back road. That way I came into town right by the hospital. There weren't very many cars out anyways. And he still followed me. I continued along this route with all its senseless turns and backtracks, and he was still following me. The creepiest part was that he always maintained pace. If I floored, he also floored. If I slowed down, he too slowed down. Not once did he honk at me. His windows and windshield were tinted, so I couldn't see the face. I tried to keep an eye out for patrolling cops, but somehow I could not spot a single one that time. I finally lost him on the real main road when I blew through a yellow light and sped beyond any reasonably defensible amount of speed, with 911 dialed in my phone and ready to go. The road ahead was clear, and now I had a head start of a good minute or so. I was watching the rearview mirror as soon as I zoomed past the orange light to make sure that he doesn't break the signal. And he did not. He waited, and that was my opportunity to escape. As I floored my vehicle, I was aiming to get rid of him at the earliest. And I knew that his vehicle was considerably faster than mine, and if I chose to simply keep driving, he was eventually going to catch up to me. So I kept an eye out for a good spot to hide my car. There were trees around both sides of the road. And if I chose to go off the road, then my wheels would leave traces on them. I was in a fix. There were hardly any alternate routes to choose from, and far too less traffic on the road. I dialed 911, and the dispatcher asked me for my location. That's when it struck me. I did not know where I was. The dispatcher tried to calm me down as she sensed I was panicking. She asked me to open Google Maps and search for the nearest police department. The network was good, and so I could see that one was hardly a few miles away. It showed that I would take somewhat 7 minutes to get there. Before speeding off, I checked the rearview mirror, and to my horror, I saw the car in distance. I informed the officer, and she asked me to keep on updating. While I gunned it to the station, she made sure that one patrol officer was headed in my direction. I gave her the description of my car, and then his car, as I could literally see it in my rear view. It was as if I was in a thriller movie's chase sequence. Finally, just as the car almost caught up to me, I heard sirens and saw lights on top of a cop car. I was safe. The other car that was chasing me overtook me and zoomed past the patrol car. He did not go after him, but just informed on the radio that he was headed towards the department. The officer assured me that someone would catch hold of him. Then he guided me home, and I reached safely. Henceforth, I was ultra cautious before going exploring such obscure places. I don't know as to what happened to it later. I did not bother to even ask, since I was literally traumatized by the incident. Had I not gotten to the cops in time, I might not have been alive to narrate this story to you all. Now let's hop on to the second story, which I'm sure you'd enjoy the most. Now let's hop on to story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. Now, as you know, I always loved exploring. And although I had a tough time coming out of that horrifying encounter, I eventually got back to my regular life. But I used to inform my friends and then go out. This one time, I was out exploring an unknown place, and I was in yet another impressively extra-rural area. Although by the time this happened, Google Maps were very popular and were being used quite extensively. So I was quite aware of how the route might turn out to be and what to expect from it. The country road over there followed the creek and then suddenly turned away from it and came up out of the valley. Then after that, there was a series of 90-degree turns navigating through fields, whose owners saw to it that the local roads wouldn't be a perfect grid pattern. It was literally so haphazard that it made me extra confused. But the scene was beautiful, and the landscape was straight out of Lord of the Rings. I had left in the afternoon, maybe the late afternoon. And by the time I had explored the place quite enough, it was fast approaching dusk on a long summer day. The windows were down, and I was playing my iPod on the radio with one of those FM transceivers that you punch in an empty radio station's frequency, and it would broadcast your iPod onto it. The next 90-degree job came up, and I found that it could go on straight if I chose it. There was no mailbox, and there was in fact even a road sign. So it was for sure a public road. There was no bridge out sign, no road closed sign, or nothing else of that sort. The road, if you went straight, wasn't paved. It was barely gravel. It was a 2-track road, with grass in the middle of it. I'm in a large Dodge Ram with a small suspension lift. I had to take a call, and I chose that I'd go ahead. I started to drive down the road, and after a small stretch with really tall corn on either side, I came to some woods. The woods were very thick, and my radio suddenly went to static. It was just reaching dusk, and there was an orange sky in my mirrors, but now it was very, very dark in these woods. And in fact, the woods got thick right from the beginning. As in, the tree line did not have a typical transition that you or I would expect. No trees and then suddenly thick woods. The road too was evolving quite rapidly. It's turning into more of a walking trail than a road to drive on. Now where a modern road would have concrete sides and guardrails over small brooks, here the gravel just used bigger rocks. It was getting more and more difficult to navigate my car over this road, and I hit a really big bump. This caused my radio to suddenly come in as clear as day. The radio guy spoke.
Do you want to die a virgin?
I laughed it off, noticeably shaken upon hearing the sudden voice on the radio. I murmured something unfriendly as a joke. It goes back to static immediately. Into my right-hand side, a meadow opened up through the trees. My worries were immediately gone, and I tore off down a small decline into the meadow, exploring in 4x4. It was getting darker with each passing minute, so I headed back to the road, which seemed more like a trail, and I turned to continue the way I was going originally. The radio was coming in and out with unintelligible talking. I reasoned to myself that it was one of those audiobook channels. I came up to a dead end, and there was no way to turn my car around. Now I had never been here before, but I could see that the trail or road used to have a bridge there, but it was long gone, and before me was air and water. I was trying to figure out if I want to try to turn around or what to do, and I noticed 5 people, 2 across the way where the road began again, and 1 on the bank opposite me, and 2 downstream on the bank I'm on. They were all staring at me, visibly confused upon seeing a car at that location. Assuming I've interrupted some fishing time, I backed out down the road towards the current roads, until I found a clearing wide enough to turn around. I decided to go through the meadow once more, not creeped out at all. Honestly, I should have been. After some time in the meadow, I noticed a spot in the tree line where I could go down to some very wet dirt, and go for it. I get down there and horse around a bit. The radio comes on again and says,
Have you made your decision?
Okay, now I was a bit creeped out, and I decided to keep my cool but exit the area at the earliest. What creeped me out the most was that the radio was now silent, not static. I made my way to go up the incline back into the meadow, but couldn't quite do it with the slippery mud. The radio came back on, and this time the voice said,
Time's up.
Then there was a static pause for a few seconds, followed by the same voice at the end.
We're coming.
Okay, I engaged in my fully freaked out mode. I turned off the radio and gunned for the exit. I made it up the incline into the meadow and noticed that all 5 guys were now in the tree line of the meadow, glaring at me. I noped the hell out of there at full speed and went flying down the trail or road back to the real road, just in time to see the sun setting down. It had gotten dark by the time I was out of that place. This entire incident was so creepy. The drive home was silent and mentally exhausting. I mean, if you think about it, it was either a very creepy incident or a massive coincidence. Who was the guy on the radio? How did I tune into his station? And how did he know my location at all points in time? Especially if the guys were at the bottom, in the water, they would simply not be able to see my car make its way through the entire route. And if there was someone else who saw me and kept talking, he would have to keep on following me throughout the journey. And if that had happened, then I would have surely spotted him. Also, how did he know that the guys I spotted in the water were coming back up? Also, I remember checking in the rear view. They never chased behind my car. They just kept looking and staring at the car. In fact, it felt like they were staring right through the windshield and straight into my soul. Was it some supernatural encounter? Maybe. I never cared to go there again. And to this moment, I have never returned there. And neither would I ever intend to. I did share this incident with my friends and family. Everyone had the same reaction as yours, where they had multiple theories, with none of them making sense. Although one friend, who was aware of the place, shared an interesting factoid. The place earlier had residents, but eventually got abandoned because of unknown reasons. Some claim that there were some old Red Indian tribes that used to reside there. And creepy shit kept on happening until the people decided to move out of that place. That also explained why the bridge was never repaired. I'll leave it up to you. Comment and let me know your theory or explanation for this incident. It was just so mentally exhausting that I still have no answers that make sense. I'd like to know your explanation for this creepy encounter. I remember that one night my wife and I couldn't get our 2-year-old and 1-year-old to go to sleep. They were driving the both of us a little crazy with their constant crying, and the worst part is that none of our usual strategies were working, and it was making us aggressive at each other. I suggested an evening drive to calm everyone down, and my wife was more than relieved at the idea. We quickly packed up the kids and headed out. The idea was to take a typically quiet county highway for a few miles to the interstate, drive about 10 to 12 miles west, then turn around and come home. The stretch of this county highway is particularly lacking in street lights, especially considering that it's located in the busy suburbs of the New York City. We had just left the local road leading to the county highway and gotten up to speed, which was about 50 miles per hour, when I spotted something in the road ahead. This stretch of the highway was frequently crossed by deers and other animals, and it's not uncommon for freshly struck carcasses to be littered with them. By the time I alerted my wife that there was something in the road, we were passing it, and it definitely wasn't a deer. We were traveling in the middle lane, on a dark highway, doing 50 miles per hour, and a person was crossing the fast lane into the path of our car. I don't think my wife and I would have been so chilled by someone crossing this section of the road, had it not been for the rest of the circumstances. Firstly, as mentioned previously too, we were already a little rattled at each other with the kids not complying with their usual bedtime routine. Next, while my wife was glad to get out of the house on this particular night, such so-called nap rides had become a thing of the past ever since our second child was born. Not only was it twice the work to pack and unpack the kids in and out of the car, but we also had twice the precious cargo to keep safe. It just didn't seem worth the trouble and risk most of the times. Although this was an exception. Perhaps the thing that shook us both the deepest out on that dark section of highway was that there were absolutely no cars in front or behind us. This person didn't have to cross at that time. They could have crossed with zero risk either 15 seconds earlier or later of us passing by. Finally, I thought the person was holding a big stick or bat. My wife didn't see this, but she also was not the first to spot the person. This stick was what tipped the scale and triggered us to call 911. The 911 operator didn't initially think the call deserved a police response. No one had been hurt, and she said people cross the highway there on foot all the time. It wasn't until I mentioned that I thought the person had a stick that the operator said she was dispatching someone to check it out. We hung up, relieved that perhaps we'd helped prevent someone who was either crazy or intoxicated, not hurt someone else or themselves. What we didn't know this whole time was that our 3-year-old was aware of everything that was happening. He'd not fallen asleep yet, and heard us call 911 and specifically mentioned that a person was in the road. I suspect that he detected we were alarmed, and when we told him it was a deer in the road that we called the police about, he said,
"But I heard you say a person, not a deer."
We felt bad for lying to him, but at the time it seemed like the right thing to do was to persist that it had been a deer and encourage him to go to sleep. We continued on towards the interstate, quietly talking about the circumstances that led us to call the cops, convincing each other that it was the right thing to do. Both kids were sound asleep by the time we made it to the juncture where I'd planned to turn around. I don't usually take the same way back home from places, mostly just for a change of scenery, and this is what I had planned to do on this night. As we took the eastbound service road towards the alternate route home, traffic came to a stop because of a car accident ahead. There was still an opportunity to take the same interstate back, so I took it, somewhat relieved that we could pass the same spot where the person was in the road, maybe getting closure that nothing bad had happened. We were only on that same dark county highway heading towards home for a few minutes, when I saw the flashing lights against the trees lining the highway. They were still mostly hidden around a big bend in the road ahead. I slowed down, my heart sinking with my wife's, the both of us already knowing what had happened. We were the first car to be stopped on the highway. From where we were stopped, we could see a car crash near the trees lining on the side. Its glass was shattered from the front, and there were no people visible. But the bat that the man had held before was lying on the road a few yards ahead. As the cop whose car was closest to the body approached our car, I heard stirring in the back seat. Oh no, I thought. Thankfully, just as our 3-year popped his head up and asked what was going, an ambulance pulled behind the cop and blocked the view of the body from our child. Before the cop could say anything, we told him what we'd seen right at this spot only 15 minutes before, while heading in the opposite direction. We told him we were the ones who had called the cops while out on our nap ride, and he told us to stay where we were so he could get our info. He returned and told us about the entire incident. Just a few minutes after we drove past the guy on the highway, there was another car. The driver was alone in the car, and he stopped upon watching him standing right in the middle of the road. The moment he slowed down, this dude charged towards him with the bat and struck the windshield. The driver floored his vehicle and bumped him while attempting to escape, subsequently hitting him hard. The crazy guy injured himself quite badly and fell on the side. 3 hours later, we made that turn on the closed highway, exited the entrance, and went home. In the days that followed, both my wife and I were sad and reflective about the situation. Having to rehash everything to an investigator a week later, we got a closure. The man was supposedly a psycho killer on the loose. There was a charge sheet on him, and the local police were already on a lookout. He was notorious for stopping unwary drivers asking for help and then killing them for fun. The police could get there on time to help the injured driver and catch hold of the psycho killer too. I love driving in the winter. The weather is chilly, and there is rarely any traffic on the highways. I can just peacefully ride my car, listening to my favorite music. I used to find excuses to go on such late-night rides, until one incident changed my perspective. Almost about 20 years ago, I was driving home from a New Year's party that ended late. I wasn't a family member, but I was invited to do some fun gigs to keep the audience pumped up. I was driving south on a major interstate highway, and it was relatively empty at about 3:30 a.m. or so. I had expected to see fewer cars, considering the time of the night, but that night there were lesser cars on the road than I even expected. At one point, in the Narrows, the retaining walls on each side get extremely high as the highway curves underneath the overpasses. And this route wasn't unfamiliar to me, so I kept driving at a good speed, despite the twisty and curvy road. I was alone in the car, and out of nowhere, a young woman jumped down from the retaining wall onto the highway and landed directly in front of my car. I hit the brakes as hard as I could, and the car came to an abrupt stop and almost nearly slammed into her. She looked up, unfazed by the near-death encounter, and rushed to my passenger door. Now I agree that it was a little careless of me not to have my car doors locked, but I would have locked them if I was driving slowly or was coming to a gradual stop where I could have expected someone jumping up on my car. But anyway, my car door wasn't locked, and the girl got inside and sat beside me. She was looking tremendously terrified. Not that I asked her, but she looked somewhat between 18 and 24 years old. She had long blonde hair, and her clothes looked a tad bit dirt-stained. I'm calling it stained because it did not look like she was homeless, but like she'd fallen down a few times. She claimed that she needed to call her mom. I tried to calm her down and began moving a little back down the highway, and I noticed some movement behind my car. Almost about 40 to 60 feet away, I saw a figure of a man jump down onto the highway and rush toward my car. I saw all of this out of my rearview window. I didn't mention this to her so as to not panic her more than what she already was. And she didn't look back or see the other person. I have heard these incidents where some random girl would show up in the middle of a highway, asking for help, and when the car stops to help her, some people jump out of hiding to hijack the car. The girl is just a trick to slow down and stop an unwary traveler. So I was cautious of this possibility too. But the problem with such hijackers is that the girl just stalls the conversation so as to buy time for the hidden gang to appear. This girl was not wasting a single moment. As I mentioned before, she jumped ahead of my car, risking her own life, and then got inside at the earliest. Also, when I saw the dude behind, she wasn't even aware that the man was coming for her. I was in no mood to confront the guy. I mean, he might have some weapon, and I might get killed. So I floored my car and gunned ahead. I sped up and went about 6 or 7 exits south. She kept repeating over and over that she just needed to call her mom. But I was helpless about this. This happened way before smartphones were common. In fact, this was before most people even had cell phones. So I calmed her down and told her that I would take her to one of the 24-hour grocery stores, and she could call her mom from their landline. I asked her if she needed money for a payphone. She did not reply. I asked her what was wrong and how she got into this situation. She said nothing other than,
"I just need to call my mom."
I pulled up to the very first grocery store that I saw and stopped. She got out quickly, but was not running towards it. Maybe she did not want to scare off the grocery store guys by charging toward them at almost 3 or 4 in the night. She got to the door and then ducked into the grocery store. She didn't say a single word to me, or even bothered to look back. I pulled into the gas station across the street and called 911. I narrated the entire story and let them know that the young woman was inside the grocery store and also provided a description of her. I told them that I had no idea as to what had even happened. I mentioned to them about the figure behind us on the highway. But I could not provide many details to them, as all I could see was a silhouette. In retrospect, that sudden turn of events really made me super uneasy. To this day, I don't know what happened to the girl. And I hope she was fine once she got inside the store, as I never saw her come out. A police vehicle drove past me while I was on my way back to my original route. So I was assured that the situation will be taken care of. I think I did the right thing, and I would have tried to do more, but she seemed emotionally fragile and somewhat afraid of me, since I too am a guy. So I wanted her to just be able to get to wherever she needed to be. Now when I drive on highways, I ensure that there are no humans waiting to jump in front of my car, that too out of nowhere. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. My highway horror story is not unexplainable as such, but scary enough to make me feel chills run down my spine. This happened to me maybe like 2 to 3 years ago. I used to throw newspapers for a modern-day newspaper. And if you know anything about modern-day newspaper delivery, it is not even close to anything like the typical little teen throwing a small bundle in the morning, just before school for his lunch money. I threw somewhat over 1,500 papers every night. I'm not even exaggerating. 1,500 newspapers. And I had to do it at night. So my shift started at night, as in I had to pick everyone's newspapers up at midnight and throw them at their doorsteps right until 5:30 or 6 in the morning. I had to roll them all by myself, also then stuff advertisements inside them, and the typical other works. It is a terribly arduous job, but it pays well above minimum wage, especially when you have a large route like the one I had. Anyway, one night I was throwing newspapers in a little place called Holt, somewhere in Missouri. It was about 45 minutes from Kansas City limits. I was throwing these out of my window when suddenly I realized that the same pair of headlights kept on passing me for a couple of times. It was too dark out, and that too in the middle of nowhere, to make out the vehicle well, but it was no doubt an SUV or Suburban. I stopped my car and watched it as it rolled past me, and went a good quarter mile down the road, before it made a large awkward U-turn back around. It did the same thing a few more times before I finished my papers on that stretch of the road, and turned around. This road was a completely flat and straight road for several miles ahead, with no light pollution at all. Amongst ourselves, we called them bitch roads, because you had to drive so far, only to throw a handful of papers, which honestly never felt worth the effort. As I was driving back, I realized the blinding headlights of the vehicle pestering me were no longer moving toward my own. They had stopped in the middle of the road. With barely enough room to drive past them, I pressed the horn and screamed a few abusive words as I flew past them. And I think I'll forever regret doing that. I was under the impression that it was just a couple hillbillies drunk and wanting to start trouble. Even going 50 miles per hour past them and going ways down the road, I heard their tires screech and the engine rev whatever it was. They had it souped up. Quickly, the situation turned shitty, like extremely shitty. They got on my trail within seconds, and my poor little beater wouldn't be able to outrun them even if it grew a new engine. They rammed my vehicle's rear end and the unmistakable pop of gunshots went off. They shot several times, out of which one bullet busted out my back window and whizzed past my head. In a panic mode, I did the only thing that came to mind and screeched Tokyo Drift style into a farmer's field adjacent to his gravel driveway. The truck followed me there too, but seemed to hit something hard and went careening past the driveway into the other half of the field. I gunned it down to this guy's house. I had never met him before and he was like a perfect stranger. I hauled my butt out of my car and began banging on the door like a madman, hoping and praying that I don't get shot by either the person in the killer mobile or the farmer I am waking up in the middle of the night. The vehicle wasn't very far away from me when almost every light in the house turned on at once. The vehicle screeched to a stop and pulled around. I saw that it is in fact an old-style Suburban with massive wheels and no license plates on it. A large burly man wearing nothing but some boxers and several other guys greet me at the door, one brandishing a rifle. In the end, it all worked out. By chance, the man was getting married in the morning and all of his buddies were over at his place for his bachelor party. Thank God not all of them got blackout drunk. I filed a police report, yet nothing ever came of it. No other reports ever came of a beat-up Suburban with no license plates. I started carrying my pistol in my delivery car after that. My vehicle had 7 bullet holes, and the back bumper of my car was missing. The thing that messes me up the most is that we never found my bumper anywhere. As if it just vanished into thin air. They rammed it, and it disappeared. Maybe they took it as a souvenir. No doubt, because for a brief moment there, I really thought I was going to be murdered. In 1996, my mother and I were driving to Montana for my aunt's wedding in the last week of December. We were driving from Colorado to Montana. I was around 5 or 6 years old, and I was sitting in my car in the passenger seat. We were in a fairly good blue rental car for the trip, because our family car definitely couldn't make the drive that far. It was almost after midnight when it got dead quiet on this stretch of forested highway. This highway was literally with no lights or houses for miles. We were in between 2 towns, somewhere just before the Montana state line. My mom was going about 65 miles per hour on one of those thin, winding roads without a care in the world when she suddenly notices a gigantic buck that was standing in the middle of the damn road. She swerved the car as quickly as she could, but the huge antlered buck jumped in the same direction, causing us to plow into it. Its body spun down the left side of the car, knocking off the mirror and denting the hell out of the door, all while releasing a barbaric forest animal death cry that was unlike anything I've ever heard since. My mom was obviously shaking, and she sped off without stopping because, firstly, what if it was still alive? And secondly, we gotta find a phone and report it, right? It took us about 20 minutes to get to the next town to find a bar. My mom ran in with me, both of us frantically crying, and all these burly men jumped up to help my mom. I presume that they thought one of us was injured or in some sort of danger. My mom relays the events through tears, and then they all look at each other asking if she kept the buck in the car. My 5-foot-tall mom told them no, and clarified that she did not drag a buck with trophy-sized antlers into the car with her 4-year-old child. They all started high-fiving and asked her for the closest mile marker to where she hid it, because that was supposedly good meat. My mom used the bar's landline phone to call the cops, and when she gave them the same story, they also asked if she kept it for meat. She figured that country people in Montana are starving weirdos. She also realized that we should push through with our journey, because we only had a few hours of driving left. We got to my uncle's house around 3:30 a.m. and immediately went to bed. Just after 7 a.m., someone starts banging on my uncle's front door, like they have some metallic fists. He opened the door and it was the cops. They had gotten about 24 calls in the previous hour, ever since the sun came up, reporting about a murder car in my uncle's driveway. It was our white rental, dotted with deer fur, and absolutely caked in blood from the grill to the trunk, with the left side of the car dented like a tune can. We had no idea that we were driving around in a car that looked like it belonged to some horror movie. My mom was horrified, and she told the cops about the deer and her call to the cops a couple of 100 miles behind, and how scary the entire incident was. The cops dead ass looked at my mom and asked her if anyone had claimed the deer for meat. We've not been back to Montana since that trip, and neither do we intend to visit it again. This one incident happened to me almost a year and a half back. One night at around midnight, I was returning home after a party, and it was like super late. I got home after long hours of driving and was ready to crash on my bed. I parked my car and got home to finish off the basic household chores. As I was about to take out the trash, a person pulled into my driveway in an SUV. My driveway is a little large, and it kinda loops around the property. He had parked with his headlights set to bright, and the face of the car pointed toward my house's front door. There was just a locked screen door between us, since my front door was open. When this happened, it was close to midnight, and since he parked so strangely, I grabbed one of my handguns before heading to the door to simply double-check that it was locked. I considered closing the actual door, but if they were there to rob me, they already knew that I was home. Also, alternatively, there was also a possibility that they could just be in need of some sort of help. I set my handgun next to the front door, close enough that I could grab it in under a second, but also out of view from the outside. A man stepped out of the SUV, which caused the interior lights of the car to turn on, and through the bright headlights, I could just barely see that he wasn't alone in the car. The man approached my front door and greeted me. I asked why he was in front of my home, and he said he was looking for a friend's house. I advised him that he wasn't at the right place, and that he should continue on down the road to find the residential area, which he was probably looking for. He claimed that he came from that same direction, and reiterated that he was looking for a friend's house. He had a smartphone in his hand, so I suggested that he use it to call his friend for directions. He gave me an excuse about how his friend wouldn't pick up. So I suggested that he typed his friend's address into Google Maps and followed the directions to get to his place. He said he tried that, but he couldn't get it to work properly. He asked me to come outside of my house at midnight to help him type an address into Google Maps. Obviously, I refused. I said, "Look, buddy, it's almost midnight. I don't know you, and you're insistent that I unlock my door and come outside to help you, which might be something that a toddler would do." He responded,
Hey man, don't call the police. I'm a military vet, and I just need some help. So can you please come outside and help me?
Now, I feel I should state here that up to this point, the police had not even been mentioned at all. So obviously, telling me not to call the police made me want to call the cops more than ever. I put one hand on my gun before informing him that I would be calling the police, and that he should leave before that happens. He started to protest, but I pulled out the gun and used the side of the barrel to close my actual door. I just wanted to show him that I was armed, but I didn't want to escalate things further by pointing a gun at him. He fled while I called the police, but nothing ever came of it. Then almost 7 months later, my neighbor ran into a similar situation where an SUV and multiple men arrived at his door, only that he was asleep when they showed up. A man rang his doorbell close to midnight. He got up and opened his front door without really looking to see who was there. As soon as he did, a man that had been standing to the side of the door out of sight pointed a shotgun to his head and walked him back into his own house. He sat there for hours with a shotgun pointed at his head, while multiple men robbed him. They didn't shoot him, but they did clean him out. He lost everything: jewelry, cash, credit cards, guns, TV, etc. They even made him give his PIN number and drove to go test it while he was still being held at gunpoint. I don't know for sure that they were the same people, but it sounded like a properly choreographed plan by these goons to loot people. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. Now that you have made it till here, I want you to choose the topic for the next video. Comment down below and let me know your favorite topics for a horror podcast. During the fall season, I was driving back to school. It was almost a 10-hour-long drive, and I had made up my mind that I was doing it all in one go. I knew that it was never going to be easy. Not being a regular driver, I thought it would be fun 10 hours of driving because I was aware that there was a lot of middle of nowhere and had a bunch of teeny tiny towns on this route. The start of the ride was wonderful. I was energetic, covering the distance at a good pace, and did not face any sort of trouble at all. After a few hours, I really had to pee, and there hadn't been any towns for quite a while. I think I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, so I did not dare to stop my vehicle. I mean, you'd never know what's waiting for you at such places. I kept driving, and finally, there was one of those freeway signs with food, gas, and lodging listed, just near the next exit. I had been driving nonstop for probably 7 hours at this point. The sign said that there was a gas station and a fast food restaurant too. Now I was sure that those places have bathrooms too, so I took the exit. Generally, those signs mean that there is something right off the freeway, but I ended up following the signs for several miles and finally saw the fast food restaurant. I had lost the track of time and just noticed that it was just starting to get dark. As I pulled into the parking lot, this little kid runs in front of my car, but I'm going slowly enough not to hit it. The entire parking lot was empty, and there wasn't much around it, mostly just trees. I get out of the car and try to see where the kid went, but I couldn't spot him anywhere. Now I was hardly managing to control my urge to pee. And more than anything else, the kid didn't seem to be lost. He just looked like those kids of carefree parents who let their children run off around the area. So I rushed inside the place to relieve my bladder. Once I got out, I was greeted by the bartender, and he asked me about my whereabouts. That's when I remembered the kid again. I looked around, and there was literally no one inside the hotel. In fact, the lights too were dimmed. I turned around to ask him if there were any couples lodging inside the hotel, as I had seen a kid out there. He laughed and asked me to ignore it. I shrugged and went outside to my vehicle and got inside it. I turned the engine on, made sure that everything was set, and started my ride. As I pulled my vehicle out of the parking spot, I noticed that the place had no lights at all. And by no lights, I mean no lights even on the inside, because it was abandoned. It looked like the ruins of a building that wasn't used for years maybe. I was dumbfounded because I had just entered and done my business. So how was that even possible? My mind immediately flashed the memory of my colleague warning me about the route. He had told me that I was going to travel across certain places that would make me go insane. So it was best to not stop and instead keep driving. It might be psychological, but either a cool breeze blew past or I randomly had a chill run down my spine. I decided to not think, but focus on my route. The exit of the parking lot was near, so I drove towards it. And when I almost got there, I saw through the mirror that the bartender was chasing behind my car. I knew I was hallucinating, but I drove even faster and exited the haunted place. I did not even bother to refuel my car at the gas station. I had a tough time navigating back to my route since I had taken an exit to get to this place. After a few minutes of driving in the middle of nowhere, I managed to get back on track. I reached home an hour or two later. The next day, I told my friend about it. He said that he has been taking that route for years now, and he never came across such a gas station or a hotel. I checked the map and there was nothing there either. The next time I had to use that route, I kept an eye out for the signboard, but to my surprise, there wasn't one. I typed about this on Reddit, but to no avail. It seemed as if I was in some other parallel universe where that place exists. I checked with some locals near that spot, and they claim that sometimes drivers do end up going there, asking for directions to the hotel, but they have never seen those vehicles return. Now let's hop on to story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. Sometime around the September of 2011, I was driving to visit my sister who lives in Missouri. It had gotten pretty late, and I admit that I was a bit tired, but not to an extent where I should have pulled over to a hotel for resting. So I continued driving, ignoring the slight fatigue, and I got to this stretch of road where it was just cornfields on either side of me. This was before Google Maps was popular, so I had been given the directions on a map. I checked the route on the map, and it showed that I had to continue driving straight and then take the next left. I drove straight and straight until I got a little nervous. I mean, the piece of the map had a left turn considerably sooner than what I had driven, and there were no lefts on the cornfield road, but multiple rights. And every now and again, I did come across a left, but it was a small man-made road that simply wasn't big enough for my car. I started getting a bit confused about where I was supposed to turn, because I'd been driving straight for about 35 minutes or so, and there was still no left turn in sight. I passed a left turn that was big enough for my car, but it was a dirt road. I figured that was probably the turn I was supposed to make. I took the turn and ended up driving around a damn cornfield paved road maze. I ended up lost for about 2 hours before I finally found the small dirt road again. I drove up and found myself at a house. Until that point, I was confident that was obviously not the correct left turn, so I threw my vehicle in reverse and went to leave when I saw some light and noticed some movement within my peripheral vision. I looked over to that side, and it was just a large group of people, maybe over 7, standing around a fire and coming in my direction. I froze for a moment. They were still significantly distant, but they were covering ground at a good pace. No matter how happy I was looking at humans after hours of being lost, it took me a while to realize that they weren't coming to help me. In fact, their faces, which were lit up by the fire, suggested the exact opposite. It was already in the middle of the night, maybe around 2:30 a.m., and I was lost in a cornfield maze. I had been driving in a maze for about 1.5 hours. I was tired and I had enough for one night, so I drove off. I got lost again and ended up driving for about an hour in the wrong direction, found a gas station, waited for morning, and rang my sister to help me find where the hell she lived. As you can tell, this was before cell phones and GPS became super prevalent, and I have tremendous appreciation for the advancement in technology. Before Google Maps, finding routes was not just difficult, it was dangerous. I am a fan of driving in the night, and because of that, I have experienced some chilling encounters. Some were really scary, but only if you were on the driver's seat like me. And they might not sound as scary if I just told you about them. However, I have a couple of stories that might spook you. The first one is when I was driving to my friend's ranch for a New Year's Eve party. This was somewhere down in Eagle Pass, near the Texas-Mexico border. It was pouring heavily that day, and I was slowly driving down on a back road with my high beams on. The visibility was poor, and I was having a difficult time looking at the road ahead when something jumped in front of my truck, paused for a mere second or two, and then darted back into the woods. I guess it was about 2 to 3 feet tall, white, and briefly stood on 2 legs. For a Lord of the Rings fan like me, I was assured that Gollum lived somewhere in South Texas. But jokes apart, that sudden appearance simply freaked me out as I was driving alone at night. And to this date, I'm still not sure as to what creature it was. My second creepy encounter was when I came across an abandoned and torn tent in the outback of Australia. I was out with my friends. We were on a road trip up the west coast of Australia, and we took a little detour inland near Carnarvon. We wanted to see the red sands and other such things unique to that place. So we drove and went down a dirt road, but there was nothing for miles, and that made us a little uncomfortable. After some 15 to 20 minutes of driving, we found a tent. We hesitantly approached it and saw that it had been torn open on one side. There was a filthy pillow and some clothes were scattered inside of it. Some shit had happened on the inside, but the tent was still firmly staked down. And it looked like it had been there a while. I just hoped that both the individuals who were supposedly living in the tent made it home safe. Again, I'm aware that this might not sound as creepy to you, but the sheer sight of one tent in a vast endless expanse was creepy, let alone the condition of items on the inside of it. Thus reminds me of another incident. This happened somewhere back home in Texas, out near Enchanted Rock. We had driven to a point and decided to hang out there for a while until we decided to drive back home. It was super late, but we were in our 20s and full of energy. We got there, and I was walking around the woods with some friends and exploring the area when we nearly stumbled into a pit. And it was no ordinary pit. This was full of rattlesnakes. I don't know if you've ever seen a snake den, but they tend to ball up into a horrifying Lovecraftian nightmare. I clicked pictures of this sight. It was creepy as hell. And I thank all my lucky stars that I did not fall into that pit. Else I might not have been here to tell you about my encounter. I was driving alone across the country on the Interstate Highway 10. Now I don't remember the precise location, but I was somewhere in the middle of the desert. My car's indicator suggested that I only had about 15 miles left in gas. So I pulled off to the very first gas station that I'd seen for the last hour. Now, since I was a considerably young driver and a woman, I had made a rule for myself that anytime I stopped for gas, I would only pay at the pump and would never leave my car or go anywhere inside, apart from the hotels where I stayed at. So I swiped my card, and as it was processing the payment, the transaction got canceled and it prompted me to see the cashier. I tried again, and halfway through typing in my code, it got canceled and told me again to see the cashier. I looked towards the convenience store in front of me and saw that it had broken windows, was boarded up, and was completely abandoned. Even the tall station sign on the top was torn apart. I did spot someone on the inside of the store, peering at me from between the boards. In the very second when I saw them, they jumped out of my view. They clearly didn't want to be seen by me, but they kept trying to get me to come into the abandoned station by canceling the transaction. But no, I was too smart to fall for this trap. So I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Just as I was about to leave, I got an SMS from an unknown number. It read something like, "You have spent $400 via your credit card." I panicked for a moment and then decided to head to the cashier to fire him. I mean, he couldn't just scam me of my money and expect to get away with it just because I was a girl. I stepped out of my car and started walking towards the store. I did not want to fight with him, but simply wanted my money back. As I reached the door and struggled to open it, I heard someone whisper inside. It wasn't so clear, but it was something like,
No! Not yet! Let her get in first!
As soon as I heard it, I froze. The realization hit me that the cashier wasn't alone inside. And worse, they wanted me to enter the store. Immediately, I bolted in the opposite direction. I heard the door squeak open behind me and footsteps chasing me. But somehow I managed to get inside the car. I started the car and by some miracle made it to the next station, which was almost 25 miles away. I used to drive trucks for a big company whose product delivery was always required to be done at nighttime. So I generally started my drive at 3 a.m. I had to drive to a few remote stores in little towns surrounding the town where my company was situated. I was about halfway through the 40-mile drive to the next town. Now, since it was past 3 a.m., it was dark out there, and there were no houses around for a long way in any direction. I looked on the side of the road ahead of me and saw a backhoe over there, which was odd in itself. Then I noticed that his bucket was extremely high, and as I was getting closer, I realized that he was gutting a buffalo that was hanging from the bucket. Now I have happened to have grown up around ranching, so I wasn't too freaked out by the sight of it. So for some reason, I decided to slow down and see if this guy needed any sort of help. I know I simply can't explain or justify this decision of mine, but it is what I did at that spur of the moment. But when I stopped next to him, he just smiled and waved at me. So I did the same thing and asked, "Need a hand?" He heard me say it and he just cracked up laughing. And it was no ordinary laugh. He was like hysterically laughing and constantly knee-slapping laughing. For some reason, I too started laughing, and so now we were two guys cracking up laughing. One was covered in blood, while the other with a truck full of bread. Gradually, the reality of this situation made its way into my sleep-deprived brain, and I hit the gas and got out of there as soon as I could. I thought about it and realized that this guy drove a tractor into the middle of nowhere to simply kill someone else's cattle. Or he was probably poaching this thing, and he was just going to load the thing into the front bucket and drive the shit back to his house at 3 a.m. Who knows how far away he had to drive that thing? I had no idea what the hell was happening, but the whole thing was pretty creepy. This one time I was at a wedding in a little prairie village that was about 100 or 120 miles away from my city. I had packed everything up once things wound down, and I was the last one to leave from the venue at 2:30 a.m. I got off the place and started to drive toward the highway, and that's when saw a big orange glow emanating from the other side of a ridge and on the other side of the railway tracks. I was a little curious, so I decided to check it out as it was so perfectly even and smooth. I had never ever seen a light like that before. I was thinking that it might be some huge bonfire for the weddings after the party. I had to drive up 2 or 3 miles to cross the tracks and crest the ridge. Once I did that, the light was still off on the horizon. I drove toward it for a few more miles, but it didn't seem to be getting any nearer. I decided that it wasn't a bonfire, and I didn't want to get myself into any sort of trouble, so I turned around and decided to head back to the city. I could still see the light in the back, but I kept driving. Almost 40 miles later, I got to the main highway, so I decided to look back again, and the light was just as big in the sky as it was back in the village. I looked at the news the next day and found out what had happened. A few underground natural gas storage tanks had ruptured and combusted, which caused a massive fire. It got to a point where there was no option but to let it burn until it ran out of fuel. It continued burning and ended up burning for 5 or 6 days. I would have been okay had I drove on to see the fire, but probably would have panicked upon seeing it. I might have assumed it to be a Chernobyl-like situation by the sight of it. So it was just as well that I didn't. It was very weird and ethereal seeing that massive light. I mean, it had such a quiet might to it, and it was drawing me to it like a moth. When I was a kid, I used to go on road trips with my family. My dad used to drive us to these random off-the-map places. He always loved driving and was passionate about night drives. So one day, my family and I were driving through the mountains. The route was a dirt road, and it was giving us the chills. I mean, apart from the chilly weather, there was a different vibe to this place. I just shrugged it off as my anxiety about going to a new unknown place, and that too at night. So we parked the car after reaching a spot where our semi-truck couldn't fit further. We got down and then walked a little ahead. We got to a small clearing at the dead end of the dirt road and saw a blue convertible with its doors open. My dad was a car enthusiast, and so he was like,
Wait, guys! Let's check this out!
He walked around the car for a few seconds, and then immediately turned and started speed walking back to us. He didn't even look at us, just ordered us to hurry. I was a little curious, so I started to walk over to the car and saw several bullet holes in the doors and blood on the seats. I ran back and said, "Dad, what happened?" And he said,
I don't know, but the hood was still warm.
We rushed back to the car, turned it around in a hurry, and gunned for home before anyone could spot us. But we were unfortunate, as we heard a car in the distance. And someone even shouted and demanded us to stop. I think we were too loud, and the silent woods would have amplified our noise. We did hear the engine in the distance for almost half an hour. The good thing was that we were getting farther in distance. After a point, we even heard another gunshot coming from the back. I mean, I know it could have been anyone, and also a cop. But we did not stop because had it been the killer who murdered the person in that blue convertible car, we too would have ended up murdered. The memory still haunts me and gives me chills.